Okay, so thank you everyone for your introductions and to not keep those who attended on time waiting. We're going to be starting. And in today's, first of all, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So in today's session, we're going to be covering these elements. Okay, so we're going to first of all talk about ISO, what is ISO, a quick introduction about ISO and about myself as your trainer. I'm going to be talking about the certification process that a company will need to go through when implementing an ISO standard within your organization. I'm going to be talking about the certification audit, which is basically um, um, the processes that we will need to go through when you are ready for certification. Okay, so here we are talking about the processes that you will go through when working with a certification body. Then I'm going to be explaining what you will need to do as a company to maintain your ISO certification. So after you get certified, what you will need to do. I'm going to touch briefly on the benefits of ISO certification. And then I'd like to go in a bit of detail, but still keeping this as an overview for the 10 clauses of four different ISO standards. Okay, so in this seminar, I'm going to be focusing on ISO 9001, ISO 14001, ISO 45001, and ISO 27001. If you are not familiar with what these standards represent, that's not going to be a problem. I'm going to be explaining as much information as I can in the 1.5 hours that we have together. The last thing that I'd like us to discuss will be to basically just a minute because someone waiting to join. Okay. The last thing that we're going to be discussing, actually talking about, will be a Q&A session whereby I'm going to leave the floor open to you so you can ask me any questions that you'd like. Of course, let's try to keep them ISO related. So before starting this presentation, I wanted to give you a quick overview about myself. So by profession, I'm a mechanical engineer. And in my first role, I was working as a quality engineer with a medical device manufacturer. Um, uh, so basically, in this job, I was overwhelmed with the huge number of procedures that this company had, and it didn't feel like the right environment for me to work. And even though I understand that um, um, in the manufacturing of medical devices, a certain element of traceability is important. Having said that, I believe that just filling in papers doesn't make anyone satisfied of their job. With that in mind, I decided to leave and I joined another company. This time I joined the construction industry, and unfortunately, I met the total other extreme end of the spectrum, whereby this company had absolutely no procedures in place, and every day felt like we're starting afresh. It felt like 51st dates, where every time, every day we were going to do something that was already done, it was being done in a different way. So there was this lack of standardization within their processes. And once again, I didn't feel like this was the right environment for me to work. In the meantime, I was reading for a Master of Science with the University of Malta on how I can help companies to work in a more efficient and structured way, which is where I've met ISO standards. And I've been using these standards now for the past 12 years to help companies to find the fine line between having way too many procedures, but at the same time to not have any procedures whatsoever in place. And it is in my experience that finding this fine line is doable, and that is actually my aim with each and every one of my clients. And I gave this introduction basically to explain that ISO certification is not bureaucratic, okay? And I will delve deeper into this topic as we move along in this presentation. So, what is ISO? First of all, there are different types of ISO standards. ISO has launched around 24,000 standards over the past years, and the most common ones, the most famous ones, are ISO 9001, which talks about quality, ISO 14001, which talks about the environment. Then we have um, um, ISO 14001 that refers to health and safety, and we have ISO 27001 that talks about information security. All of these are management systems. So when I explained that there are 24,000 standards, not all of these 24,000 standards relate to management systems. Actually, the vast majority of these standards relate to product standards. Okay, for example, how an HDMI cable should be, the standard for a socket outlet of electricity, and other technical standards relating to specific products. And then there are around 20 or 25 management systems that can be adopted by most industries. Naturally, these types of standards that we are seeing over here can be adopted by any type of industry. And then, for example, as I spoke with Raisa earlier, who's involved in the manufacturing of medical devices, then there are other standards, for example, ISO 13485, that is more suitable for a company within that industry because it specifically talks about quality management in medical devices. Okay, there are other standards, for example, ISO 22000, which talks about food safety. Okay, which once again can only be used by specific industries. In this case, for example, only companies that handle food items. So these four standards are management systems that can be used by any entity operating in any industry. And the main aim of each of these standards is to meet requirements. Okay, what type of requirements? If we go back to the previous slide, we will see that, for example, when talking about ISO 9001, we have to meet quality requirements or customer requirements. When talking about ISO 14001, we have to make sure that we are protecting the environment, so we are meeting environmental requirements. When talking about health and safety, we have to, of course, meet health and safety requirements, and information security, naturally, it's the same. And something that I want to mention straight off as early as I can in this presentation is that having an ISO certification doesn't mean that you're going to be perfect. I would dare say that no company will ever be perfect. Okay, so you cannot wait to be perfect to attempt to get an ISO certification because an ISO certification is effectively a system for continual improvement. Okay, nothing will ever be perfect. We just have to keep on striving. We have to always keep on pushing to continually improve ourselves. Okay, and ideally, we take decisions based on data rather than based on opinions. So, when, for example, we are taking financial decisions, we will determine whether we have enough money to make a particular investment depending on what our accountant tells us, depending on what our figures in our accounts are saying. And it's the same thing when we are implementing a management system. If, for example, we are implementing a health and safety management system, then we will want to improve our health and safety performance based on data rather than on the opinion of anyone within the company. And more often than not, I find that when companies are not being managed based on data, rather than they're being managed on conversations or opinions, we would have statements, for example, we never have accidents or we always do that. And it is in my experience that that would be an overgeneralization, okay, whereby never doesn't necessarily mean 0 times. It might mean 3 times a year, which is still a figure. okay? And always, it might not always be 100%, it might be 97 or 80%. So as you can see, if we start to implement this mentality of having critical numbers that are important for that specific management system, then we are bound to take certain decisions that will inevitably be based on data. Therefore, we are all talking about the same elements and we are prioritizing the same criteria within our management system. So, when talking about these standards, these types of standards can be applied by any organization, okay, in any industry, and depending on the size of the company and on other risks that might be pertaining to the specific company, then we're going to choose different ways in which to implement the standard. And I'm mentioning this because I want to make it absolutely clear, as in this seminar, for example, we have people in manufacturing, companies in customer support, we have companies from the medical industry, freight forwarding industries. Just in this seminar, you can see that there are people in different industries. And so the standard can never tell you what you have to do to meet a particular requirement. The standard will only tell you the consideration you will need to make, the requirements that you will need to meet. It is then up to you as a company to adapt the requirements of that standard to best suit the needs of your organization. And I would say that is where it would be wise for companies to recruit the services of a consultant like myself to make sure that we are adapting the needs of the standard in the way that best suits the needs of your organization. Unfortunately, the standard likes to repeat itself a little bit and uses some very ambiguous terminology, making it relatively hard for anyone attempting to implement the standard just by reading it at first glance. Because you might think that this is a new requirement that wasn't mentioned anywhere else within the standard. However, each and every element in the standard is mentioned two, three, four, and sometimes five times, okay? And therefore, we don't need to do the same thing five different times. So, implementing the standard in a diligent way will make sure that you are creating a management system that actually meets the needs of your organization rather than adapting the needs of your organization to meet the needs of the standard. A bit of history about the standard, and unfortunately, like with most things in the world, ISO started with a war. So in World War One, there was a problem where allies were bombing bombs on enemy territory and they were not exploding. But in World War II, they had a much bigger problem whereby the bombs were exploding inside the factories of their subcontractors. Okay, so allies weren't producing the bombs themselves. They were asking subcontractors to produce the bombs on their behalf. And in some of these factories, bombs were exploding. So allies asked all of their subcontractors to create the first draft of what their management system looked like. And basically, everyone created a system like they thought was best. Of course, this created an issue for the allies whereby they had to try to decipher the logic that everyone used to create these systems, this management system. Based on that, they told them, you are right, there isn't a guideline that you have to follow on how to create a management system. And so that gave rise to the first version of a standard, which incidentally, it was a quality management system. Okay? So that was the first version that was created. On the 23rd of February, 1947, the International Organization for Standardization was launched in the UK, and as you can see, it should be technically IOS. Okay, so International Organization for Standardization. So I have absolutely no idea why they decided then that it should be ISO, not iOS. Either because there must have been some type of influence by the French, which in which case it would be ISO, not iOS, if said in French, or because Apple, and I highly doubt it, because they knew that Apple were going to launch iOS 20, 30 years down the line. So, joking aside, ISO has been around since 1947, and as I explained, they have launched around 24,000 standards along the way. But we are talking about the management system standards, and of those, there are around 20 to 25. And each and every one of these standards gets updated every so often. Okay. For example, when it comes to ISO 9001, the latest version that we have is 2015. And here I would like to take a side note and explain that whenever you see, for example, ISO 9001 colon a number, that number will be the date of the latest version of that particular standard. Okay, so right now with ISO 9001, we have the 2015 version, and with ISO 14001 as well. As regards ISO 45001, the latest version is of 2018, and ISO 27001 was last updated in October of last year. And what I can tell you is that, as you can imagine, back in 1987, which is when the first version of ISO 9001 was launched, the world was dominated by manufacturing. So these standards naturally met the needs of industry and focused a lot on manufacturing. And although, as is evident from this seminar, manufacturing is still one of the key players when it comes to ISO certification, I would say that more than 50% of my clients aren't within the manufacturing industry because there are so many other industries that need to use these ISO standards. And so the standard was adapted over time with each and every iteration and update of each of these standards to be more suitable for all industries. And also, it is true that in previous versions of the standard, there might have been a particular focus on bureaucracy. Having said that, nowadays there is a focus on efficiency, and the standards are also mirroring this increased awareness of efficiency, and that really and truly no one has time to waste filling in useless papers, because we all know that life is complicated enough and that these standards should meet the needs of us as clients rather than we have to change all our procedures to meet this international standard. So each and every version, as soon as it is updated, it makes it more relevant to the needs of the organization. For example, taking a side note and talking just a little bit about ISO 27001, which talks about information security. As you can imagine, in the version that was previous to this latest version, and the version before the latest version of ISO 27001 was that of the 2013 version. So as you can imagine, 10 years ago, the technology when it comes to information security was vastly different, okay? And so this standard, for example, 10 years ago didn't talk about cloud computing, it didn't talk about software as a service, it didn't talk about remote working, okay? It eliminated, as in it didn't mention some of these elements because they weren't a thing 10 years ago. Nowadays, software as a service, we're using one, all of us right now, for example, which is Google Meet. And as you can imagine, the rise of technology gave rise to new risks when it comes to information security. So these standards get updated over time to better suit the needs of industry as they go along. And the changes between one standard and the next is typically not large enough that you will need to dismantle everything that you've built and start from a blank page, but rather you will need to make a few adjustments to your management system to meet the requirements of the standard. By any chance, does anyone have any questions up to this point? I'll take that as a no. So, the certification process. The certification process is based over 10 major steps, okay? And this is how I like to work with my clients when implementing any type of management system within their organization. So the first thing that I focus on will be to choose the implementation team. And this will inevitably be formed up of certain people from top management, okay, so the leadership team within the organization. However, I also like to include people from different roles within the organization to make sure that we are not creating an image of how we'd like to the company to operate only, but also I'd like to get feedback from people who are on the ground doing the day-to-day work to make sure that we are having impact as an input of what actually happens in real life. Okay, so the implementation team is definitely a choice that I instruct my clients to do as a first step before starting the implementation process to make sure that everyone is on the same side, on the same page, excuse me. The second thing that you'll need to do when implementing an ISO standard will be to do some type of training. Okay, so the training will inevitably revolve around the type of standard that you'd like your company to get certified to. And I give this type of training to my clients both at the kickoff meeting when we are starting the implementation process, but the training goes throughout the whole implementation process, okay, from start to finish. If I'm working with a client, I will of course be providing answers to any questions they might have to make sure that they have the information that they need. Here, when it comes to training, many people ask me, for example, for lead auditor courses. And even though I am a lead auditor myself for all of these standards that I am mentioning, you do not need to be a lead auditor to implement or to audit your management system. Okay, so having training and experience is enough to make sure if you've had experience working on the standard, that should be enough for you to be able to do audits or to work with me to implement ISO within your organization. However, I want to point out once again that not even to work with a certification body is it a requirement to have an actual lead auditor certificate. Okay, these lead auditor trainings are offered by certification bodies. They are offered at I would say high price point. We're talking about a 1,500 euros fee for a 1 week course. Okay, and here, when you are attending these types of courses, it is expected that you actually already know all the requirements of the standard. Okay, so when talking about training in the implementation process, we are definitely not talking about having someone within the organization, for example, attend these lead auditor courses, but rather to have someone within the organization or more than one person within the organization to be familiar with all the requirements of the standard and how these can be adapted to the needs of your organization. The third thing that we will do is to set the boundaries for certification. And if you've already worked with a certified company, then you might be familiar with the term scope of certification. So the scope of certification is, first of all, what you will have actually written on your ISO certification once you are certified. Okay, it will tell you as an organization, for example, you do manufacturing of medical devices. Okay, and it will be vague like that. Okay, for example, for Get Zevac, we are talking about manufacturing. So here we can, for example, say manufacturing of, and we can give 2 or 3 examples of the major products that you specialize in. Okay. So as you can see, when we are talking about the boundaries of certification, or the scope of certification, we are talking about what you do as a company in a few words. Typically, this will be 5 to 7 words, okay? And it will explain what you do as a company, and inherently, it will also say what you don't do as a company. What does this mean? Let's say that as a company, I import microphones and cars, 2 random products. And I choose to get certified just for the importation of cars, not of microphones. If in my scope of certification, I say that our company does importation and distribution of cars, then whilst being audited for any of the ISO standards, no one will ask me any questions about microphones because that is not part of the scope of certification. So that is why it's critical to start with the scope of certification because it literally sets the boundaries for certification. Are we including all product ranges? Are we including all sites of your company? So if your company, for example, is a multinational company and you have offices in different locations, are we going to include all offices or are we going to include a particular branch or the head office? If your company, for example, has more than one product, are we going to include all of your products? And are we going to include all departments? Okay, so maybe we might not want to include a particular department, for example, the after sales department, for any particular reason. Of course, when setting up the boundaries for certification, it's very important to include someone who's very experienced in implementing ISO standards to make sure that whatever you are including and excluding makes sense in the context of your organization. And the 3 next points that I'd like to talk about revolve around documentation, okay? As I explained, I really don't like documentation. I hate bureaucracy. I know that hate is a big word, but I actually hate bureaucracy because I find that filling in papers that no one will ever read is a poor use of my time. Having said that, there are other types of documentation, for example, filling in a check, okay, to pay someone. That's another type of documentation. So as you can imagine, there are important and not important documentation that we can have within our organization. It is my aim for all of my clients to make sure that we are only focusing on the documentation that is relevant to my clients and to not focus on documentation that is just there to look nice or to please any ISO auditor. My job isn't to make sure that the auditor, the external auditor, is happy when he comes to your company. My job is to make sure that you, as my clients, are happy and that you are running an efficient business and that after all, you get certified. So when talking about these 3 types of documentation types, quality manual, or rather I should say management system manual, because if you're creating a health and safety management system, then you're going to create a health and safety manual. If you're creating an information security management system, then you're going to create an information security manual. And if you're getting certified for both, then you need to create both. So we have the manuals, we have the key processes, and we have the supporting system. And I'm going to be explaining each and every one of these right now. Starting with the manual. First of all, I want to point out that since the version of 2015, all standards coming after 2015, including ISO 9001, 45001, 14001, and 27001, they do not have a requirement of having a management system manual. Having said that, I still like to create the manual because it serves as a consolidation document, I should say, where all, or rather some critical information will be stored within these manuals. In these manuals, for example, we will create the needs and expectations of interested parties, and I will delve a little bit deeper into these later on in today's presentation. I will do a SWOT analysis, that is also a requirement. And I will need to do a SWOT analysis. Without the manual, it will just be a loose document. If we're going to have the manual, then there is a specific place where such a SWOT analysis can go. Okay? So the first thing that we're going to do is to create this manual, and here we're going to place all this, I would call, static information that doesn't change very frequently. Okay? Typically, you will need to update the management system manual for your organization at a frequency of once a year or once every 2 years. Okay, so this doesn't need to be updated very frequently. Mind you, when working with clients, I update and create the manual myself, I create the key processes myself, and I also create the supporting system myself. So once the manual has been created, the second thing that we're going to focus on is to identify the key processes. Now, when it comes to ISO 9001, which is relating to quality, this talks about four main topics. Okay, we're talking about the sales process, the purchasing process, operations, and if you have applicable within your organization, we have design and development. For each of these questions, I'm going to be asking you 1,000,001 questions. For each of these processes, sorry, I'm going to be asking you 1,000,001 questions to make sure that I have all the information that I will need to create these procedures or flowcharts myself. Okay, so after meetings together, I will not send you with homework, but rather I will create these flowcharts myself. When it comes to other standards, for example, when it comes to information security, the key processes that we are talking about are about managing your risks relating to information security. More specifically, this fifth step, which is map out the key processes, talks about the activities that you have to do as an organization to meet the requirements laid out in the standard in clause 8. And I have a slide about clause 8 for each and every one of these four standards that we are mentioning today. So I'll delve into that a little bit later in today's presentation. So once the key processes have been defined, then we are going to create the supporting system. Okay, so for now, I'm giving you an overview of these 10 steps that you will have to go through when implementing a management system within your organization. So after the manual has been created and the processes have been defined, then we're going to create what I call the supporting system. And the supporting system, I would say, is common to all different types of standards, okay? And here we are talking about topics, for example, corrective actions. So what will happen when something goes wrong? We are talking about job descriptions. We are talking about evaluating your suppliers. We're talking about setting up and measuring objectives relating to your management system. We're talking about having a good upkeep of your equipment to make sure that it is available whenever it's needed. Okay? So these are elements that your client doesn't pay you to do directly. Okay? But if you don't do them, then your client will not be happy. Just to give you an example, let's take the job descriptions, for example. So job descriptions are one of the requirements of the standard. And as a side note, when creating job descriptions that are compliant with the requirements of ISO, we don't have to just create the roles and responsibilities, but also we have to define the competencies that are needed or the skills that are needed for a person to do those particular roles and responsibilities. Okay? And when talking about ISO 9001, for example, we're going to focus on the roles and responsibilities and competencies or skills that are needed by a person filling a particular job title to meet the requirements of the client. But if we're talking about health and safety, then we're going to make sure that specific or some job titles have within their roles and responsibilities some roles that have to do with the protection of the environment. And when it comes to competencies, we have to define what is needed in terms of the company to um, um, define basically what is needed when it comes to competencies or skills that are needed for that particular person to execute their job when it comes to health and safety. So, as you can see, when implementing these standards, ultimately we have to follow the same mindset and the same logic. And in some points, we can also use the same documents. We just have to give different focus depending on the different types of standards that we are creating. So, once the quality manual has been created and we've inputted what I call this static information, once the key processes have been defined and mapped out, and once the supporting system has been created, then effectively we would have created all the documentation that is needed for a company to meet the requirements of the standard. And inevitably, when creating these documentation, we're going to define some things that will need to be done in a slightly different way. And here I'd like to take another side note and explain that when implementing a management system, don't try to change a million things at once. Okay. I like to show how smart I am with my clients by making as little changes as possible and still get them ISO certified. Mind you, when offering my service, I offer a full money back guarantee. And I'm mentioning this because I keep on saying how little documentation I like to use, but at the same time, I want to make sure that my clients have that peace of mind that they are getting certified. So going back to step 7, which is system deployment, when you have mapped out all the documentation of your organization, you're going to inevitably find some things that will need to change within your organization. And at the system deployment change, we are going to make these small changes that should have big improvements within your organization. Granted, these improvements might not be felt or experienced from the first day of implementing them. The first time I went to the gym, I felt absolutely the same. But if you consistently go to the gym every day for multiple years, there won't be one specific day where you will feel the improvement, but rather the improvement will be gradual and it will be there for everyone to see. The same thing goes when you're implementing a management system, in the sense that you will not say, "Il, we're now working in a perfect way." Again, no one will ever be perfect, but probably there won't be a point where you say, okay, we've improved. It will come over time. Okay. And this type of improvement will be kick-started at the system deployment stage, and it will be something that will never finish until you decide to wind down your company, which hopefully never happens. We always have to be continually improving if we want to be in operation. If we are not improving and we are staying the same, the market and our competitors are changing and they are improving. And by staying the same, relatively, you are going down. Because if everyone in your industry is going up and you're staying the same, then it is inevitable that you will become irrelevant in a few years' time. So, system deployment, the system is implemented, and we are working with these small changes that will have big improvements in the future. And effectively, what this means is that you are following the systems that we would have discussed and defined at the quality manual or management system manual, key processes, and supporting system. And what this means is that once we get to the internal audit stage, okay, everyone within the company should technically be following these systems that you would have implemented within your organization. And once again, this doesn't mean that you will be perfect or that everyone in your company will be following all the procedures to the dot, but rather it means that you have a foundation to start. When we are doing an internal audit, for those of you who are not familiar with the mentality of an internal audit, first of all, you can either do the internal audit yourself, or typically I would do it for my clients. So this is not done by the external certification body. It is done either by me who, if I'm working with you, it's as if I'm working with your organization, or done by someone within your organization. And when we are doing an internal audit, we're going to follow an order from start to finish. So let's say that, for example, in the case of Tristan, there was a request, for example, from one of you of the clients of your client in this case, and we're going to follow that request from start to finish. Okay, so we're going to first of all see for which brand does that client's client is. Then we're going to see how the sales process happened for that particular client, how we agreed on the service that we are going to be offering to that particular client. Then we're going to talk about any purchasing of any particular software, for example, that we had to do to meet the requirements for that particular client. Then we're going to talk about the operational processes. How was it handled from all processes, not to go into the details of any organization. So how was it handled from an operational point of view to meet the requests of the clients? Taking a more unbiased example, and let me give an example of a manufacturing company, for example, once again, manufacturing pens. So how did we get the request from the client to manufacture a certain amount of pens? What were the raw materials that we needed to purchase to manufacture that type of batch? How did we create the purchase orders for the suppliers? Okay, how did we make sure that we received a good quality product from our suppliers? And then we can move on to the manufacturing process, whether any in-process checks were done during the manufacturing of that particular batch, okay, or whether there's any particular quality sampling that is done by the company to make sure that the quality of the product meets the requirements of the clients. And then we will go further and beyond just the key processes, and then we will see where the people involved in the process is trained. Can I see their training records? Can I see any training plans that you have for these people? Can I see the evaluation that you did for the suppliers where we purchased this raw material? Can I see the maintenance records for the equipment that was used to manufacture this specific type of pen? So as you can see in the internal audit, we will take one, two, or three random clients, and we will follow the processes of your organization from start to finish to make sure that everything is happening as we would have defined within your documentation. Once the internal audit has been complete, and actually just a side note about the internal audit, the aim of an internal audit isn't to point out fingers of who's not following procedure, okay? It's not a punishment. Maybe that person didn't follow procedure because their system is better than the procedures that we would have created whilst implementing the standard, okay? In which case, we would update the processes to reflect what is being done in reality. In my experience, more often than not, the processes that we would have created together during the implementation process would be how the company should actually work. And if someone isn't following those procedures, then we will train them, we will make sure that they know how to follow the respective procedure, and then we will create a training record to have evidence that that person has trained. So if that person keeps on repeating the same mistakes over and over again, it is definitely not the fault of the procedure if other people can follow the procedure. It is definitely not the fault of not having enough training because we have training records showing that that person has been trained. In that case, it might be that the person isn't at the right seat if they are repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And I'm giving these examples to show that ISO certification isn't about meeting this international standard that is too high up for anyone to actually reach, but that the mindset and principles that are mentioned within these standards can actually be implemented by all types of companies. I have clients who employ one person, and I have companies who employ more than 1,000 people. Okay, so these standards can be adapted to the needs of any organization to make sure that they are helping you to actually improve. So once the internal audit has been complete, then we will need to do a management review. Management review is defined, the agenda of the management review is defined in the standard itself, and it tells us a list of points that we have to discuss between top management, okay, to further identify areas for improvement. And as you can see, we are going to continually be looking for more ways in which we can improve our management system because if you remember from the first one of the first slides of this presentation, I mentioned that the main aim of a management system is that you continually improve, and the idea is that you improve based on data rather than on the opinion of anyone within the organization. Okay? Okay. So, once the management review meeting has been completed, then we can move on and talk to a certification body. And I'm going to explain the process of working with a certification body. So first of all, I'd like to explain briefly that I am not a certification body. So this is like when you're getting your driver's license, okay? You will need, in the case of Malta, for example, because I know that we have attendees that aren't based in Malta, but in Malta, to get your driver's license, the first thing that you'll need to do will be to go to a school that will teach you on how to drive a car on Maltese roads, okay? And then you will need to go to Transport Malta, who is the entity who is allowed to actually give you your driving license. The same thing happens with ISO. I would be the school teaching you how to implement or drive or run a management system, and then you will need to go to a certification body which will give you the certificate. And in Malta, for example, right now we don't have any certification bodies who are just based in Malta, but given that I in ISO stands for international, we can work with certification bodies from around the world. Certification bodies are typically not government entities. Once again, in Malta, the only certification body that we had was a government entity, but now they are not keeping up with work, so they are not accepting any more clients. So in other parts of the world, it would typically not be a governmental body, and that is how it differs from getting your driver's license. So getting a driver's license, there will typically be one government entity that can issue the driver's license. Certification bodies, there are different certification bodies from all around the world, and you can choose to work with whoever you want. So going back to this presentation, the first process that we will have to go through when choosing a certification body or to do a certification audit will be to go through the commercial process. And the commercial process will need to start by finding a suitable accredited certification body for your needs. And here I have two things that I have to mention. First of all, what is accredited? If you are not working with an accredited certification body, then your certificate is worth nothing, okay? You might as well create your ISO certification yourself. So when working with a certification body, it is very important to make sure that you work with an accredited certification body. I don't want to go into a lot of technicalities or details. I just want to explain that there is a certification body, okay? The certification body, if it's accredited, it will be audited by an accreditation body, and an accreditation body, there is one of these throughout each country of the world. For example, in Malta, it would be NAB, National Accreditation Body. In the UK, it would be UCAS. In Italy, it would be Accredia, so on and so forth. So all certification bodies will be accredited by the accreditation body where they are registered, and they will be audited. Accreditation bodies are audited by ISO itself. So there is this element of accountability. If you are working with a certification body that is not accredited, they are not audited by anyone, so basically they can do whatever they want. So working with an accredited certification body is extremely important. And then there is the term for your needs. There are different types of certification bodies. Some have a very famous brand like Bureau Veritas, SGS, TUV. Some have less famous brands, but they are still accredited, in which case there is a huge difference in price because of brand. If you are working with an accredited certification body, um, um, the brand shouldn't make any difference, but rather you should just work with an accredited certification body. Moving forward, once you find the certification body that you'd like to, or a few certification bodies that might meet the needs of your organization, then you're going to contact them and you're going to get the quotes from such certification body, and you're going to appoint the certification body for auditing your organization. Once that is done, then there is the technical process. Okay, so the technical process is split into three major steps. First of all, we have stage one audit, and stage one audit is also called a desk audit, and this is done by the external auditor that is chosen by the certification body. So you will not choose the person who will do the certification audit, you will choose the certification body, which will in turn send you an external auditor. The external auditor will effectively compare the documentation that you would have for your organization, and if you are working with me, therefore, the documentation that I would have created for your organization with the requirements of the standard to make sure that your documentation meets all the needs, all the requirements of the standard. Okay. Once that is ready, okay, and it shows that all the documentation for your organization meets all the requirements of the standard, then we can schedule a stage two audit, which is also called a field audit, whereby the auditor will physically visit your organization to make sure that you are doing in reality what you are saying that you are doing in your documentation. So stage one, they will compare the documentation to the standard. Stage two, they will compare your documentation to what you are doing in reality. That if your documentation is saying that you are doing steps A, B, C, it means that in reality, they're going to check that you are actually doing steps A, B, and C. And once the auditor would have completed their audit, they will either recommend your company for certification or not. Okay? It is in my experience that whenever an external auditor recommends your company for certification, it will mean that you are going to get certified. So after the external audit has been completed, the external auditor will go to their office once again, have a conversation with the audit committee of the respective certification body, and they will decide whether to grant you ISO certification or not. If you're going to get your ISO certification, you will receive the certificate within 1 or 2 weeks after the external audit has been completed. Once you get your ISO certification, I was going to say the journey doesn't end there. I would say the journey starts there, okay? Because just like when I graduated as an engineer, for example, it didn't mean that I knew everything I needed to know about engineering. Rather, I would say I knew how many topics I didn't know, okay, about engineering, because it's such a vast subject. And we should apply the same mentality when getting ISO certified. So once you are ISO certified, it doesn't mean that you are perfect, that you are now meeting this international standard for quality or for information security, and you should just celebrate and leave it at that. Rather, the journey for continual improvement has just started, okay? And therefore, it is inbuilt within the requirements of the standard that to maintain your ISO certification, you will need to do an internal audit every year, you need to do a management review every year, and certification body will need to come audit you once every year as well. Granted, when you receive the certificate, it will have a validity or expiry date that lasts 3 years. Okay. Having said that, you will still need to do these three things every year. If not, the certification body has the right to revoke your ISO certification. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Okay. The benefits of ISO certification. I'm not going to talk about this for a very long time because I understand that you already appreciate the importance of ISO certification, and that is why you're actually in this call. There are two types of benefits. Okay, first of all, there's the brand positioning benefits, and there are the business performance benefits. I am clearly much more interested in the business performance benefits because they are the reason why you actually have brand positioning benefits. Okay, so if you are ISO certified, you're going to have a better reputation in the market. You're more likely to acquire prestigious customers and suppliers, and you're going to have more repeatability because you're going to have a standard way in which you operate as an organization, which will in turn lead to an improved customer satisfaction. And you will get these benefits because of these three main business performance benefits. First of all, improved business efficiency. As I explained, when you are mapping out the key processes of your organization, you should go into as much detail as possible to map out how you work as an organization. And when working with clients, most of the time I get very intelligent replies of why something is done in a particular way. Other times I hear because that's how we've always done it. And that is how I know that there is definitely room for improvement over there. So the first one is improved process efficiency, whereby if you are actively looking at how your processes are functioning and you map them out on a piece of paper and you have the critical stakeholders discussing that flowchart or that process, invariably you're going to eliminate a few steps within your process, and that will help you to work in a more efficient way and to reduce the often hated bureaucracy. Okay, so improved process efficiency. Second one, it's management by data. So as I have explained in one of the first slides of this presentation, with all of my clients, I will want them to take decisions based on quality, information security, health and safety, environment, and any other standard that they might be implementing. I will want them to have metrics, I will want them to have data that they are actively monitoring that will in turn help them to make sure that they are taking informed decisions based on data rather than on opinions. And if we start taking decisions within our organization based on data rather than based on opinion, then that will lead us to taking decisions that have actual benefit and can bear a lot of fruit to our organization. By looking at decisions based on data, we are more likely to be able to identify and pick low-hanging fruit that might add significant value to our organization. But also, we can also tackle more difficult problems because if we have the data, then we can know what type of issues we are facing. Let's take health and safety. Saying that we rarely have an incident might be one thing, but if we say that we have 7 incidents in a year, okay, and 4 of them relating to, for the sake of the argument, um, bad posture when picking up heavy items, then that will mean that by improving that particular element within our management system or within our processes, we will be able to reduce almost half of our incidents. Okay? So as you can see, that is a practical example of taking decisions based on data. I've seen examples of a manufacturing company, for example, who even though they are a large manufacturing company, they didn't have any records of the types of complaints or quality issues that they had. And once they started mapping out this information, they realized that they can literally reduce more than 80% of their complaints by solving two or three issues within their manufacturing process. Okay, so this led to having a reduction, I believe it was around 180 defects or complaints in the first year to, I believe it was around 30 in the second year. It was that type of improvement. Okay, so management by data is the second benefit. Third benefit is improved employee morale. And here I'd like to take a side note. I mentioned earlier that as part of the implementation process, you're going to choose an implementation team. The more people you involve in the implementation team, the more people are going to be committed on the improvements that you're going to come up with. I don't like to go to companies and tell people what they need to change, especially if they've been doing the process for a large number of years. However, I like to talk with them to understand what issues they are facing in their day-to-day running of the operation. Given my experience in ISO standards, I know which issues might be relevant to the standard, and then I will ask them to come up with solutions to their own problems. And once they come up with solutions to their own problems, they will invariably be very committed to making sure that those solutions work, because no one likes to say that their solution wasn't good enough for the problem. No one likes to say that their ideas weren't good. So if someone came up with an idea for improvement, we should, if we think that it's in line with our overall strategy, we should let them implement that idea. And like that, we can make sure, and it will be very easy to ensure that that particular person has full ownership of their idea because they want their idea to work. This, in turn, will lead to having motivated employees because they will feel and they will see that their company is actually interested in their opinion and is motivated to allowing them to improve their processes based on their own ideas. Okay, so by having that sense of ownership of the improvement project, we will not only make sure that their ideas are actually implemented, and we're not going to have a lot of resistance to change, and we're not going to try to force or make people change, but rather employees will see it like, because we are investing time and energy to actively listen to what they have to say, which in turn will help them to feel connected with the company, which in turn will hopefully lead to having improved employee morale. An integrated management system. So, what is an integrated management system? When it comes to these ISO standards, ISO 9001, 14001, 45000, 27000, even other standards like food safety management, so ISO 22000 and others, all standards that have been launched after 2015 follow what we call the high-level structure. And what this effectively means is that they have the same clause numbers. Okay, so clause 4 in ISO 9001 will be the same clause for ISO 27001. The only difference is that, and clause 4, by the way, is the context of the organization. So when considering the context of the organization, for example, for ISO 9001, we have to focus on quality. So if we're talking, for example, about the interested parties, then we're going to talk about the needs and expectations of interested parties when it comes to quality. If we're talking about clause 4 still, but this time we're talking about information security, we're still going to talk about the needs and expectations of interested parties. This time we're going to focus on information security rather than on quality. Okay, so as you can see, this makes it very easy for us to have multiple standards following the same logic and the same structure, and it makes it easy for organizations to be certified to more than one standard. And a critical step when implementing any management system isn't to start from a blank slate, but rather than seeing what the organization has. And here I'd like to take a quick side note whereby I know, and I haven't worked for a minute with any of you as companies, I know that you have 80% of the requirements of the standard already in place. Why? Because the requirements of the standard are, I would say, make business common sense. Okay, so if you are not following any of the requirements of the standard, you are bankrupt and you are seeking on how you're going to do liquidation rather than how you're going to implement these ISO standards. It is up to us during the implementation to find the best way in which the requirements of the standard can be adapted to the needs of your organization, okay, to make sure that we are using what you already have and adapting it to the needs of the actual standard. Okay, so starting from what you already have is an extremely important step. What procedures are in place? What forms are already in place? And do you have any of the supporting systems? Like, do you have a system for risk management, for equipment maintenance, for employee training, for corrective and preventive actions? Okay, is there a manual that describes your current system? Because if we start with that type of information, then we're going to make sure that we are creating a management system that is based on what you have, rather than destroying everything that you have built over the years and starting from a blank slate. Okay? And now I wanted to go through each of these 10 clauses within the standard, okay, to explain what they are mentioning. And before even starting, I wanted to let you know that clauses 1, 2, and 3 don't say much. Okay, so for example, clause 1 talks about the scope of the particular standard, and for example, ISO 9001 in clause 1 tells us that it's a quality management system. ISO 14001 in clause 1 tells us that it's an environmental management system. So as such, there aren't any requirements that we have to meet in this case. Clause 2 talks about the normative references, which is a different way to say legal requirements or documents of external origin. Okay? So here, for example, when talking about ISO 9001, we can list any laws and regulations that are specific to your product. Okay? If we're talking, for example, about ISO 27001 and you're in Europe, then we're going to talk about the GDPR, okay, which is, of course, an InfoSec regulation. If we're going to talk about health and safety, then in Malta, for example, we have the OHSA Act, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, okay? So here, we don't need to necessarily go into a lot of detail. In clause 2, we will need to list the laws and regulations that are relevant to that particular standard that we are implementing as interpreted for our organization. Okay. Terms and definitions. Okay. Here, I like to define any abbreviations or ambiguous terminology that is used by my client, okay, within their management system. For example, CAPA might mean corrective or preventive action. X works might be that it will be delivered from a particular place. FOB, CIL. Okay, so these are terminology that is used within the freight forwarding industry. Um, Other industries might have initials, for example, of clients, major clients they work with. And the idea is that if someone um, for example, if you're a corporate services provider, you might have MA, mergers and acquisitions, as one of your abbreviations. So that if someone joins your company and they see MA, ABX, BAB, they will know what these words mean if they are reading the manual or any other documentation within your organization. Of course, there might be, for example, for ISO 27001, we might have DPO, which is Data Protection Officer. We might have GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Requirement. So each of these industries might have specific abbreviations or ambiguous terms that might relate to that specific standard or that specific field of study, I should say. Okay? And the actual juice of the standard, the actual requirements of the standard start from clause 4, okay? Where clause 4, as I explained, talks about the context of the organization. And then clause 4 in particular is split into two sub-clauses. Clause 4.1 talks about the internal and external issues. And here what we mean is that we have to do a SWOT analysis. So, okay, so if you read the standard, it will paint a picture of something very complicated and hard that will need to be done. But if you read in between the lines, okay, you will see that it's telling you to do a SWOT analysis. And a SWOT analysis basically covers the internal and external positive and negative issues that have to do with your organization, okay? So when we are considering the positive issues, okay, if they are internal, they are strengths. If they are external, they are opportunities. When considering the negative issues, if they are internal, they're going to be weaknesses. If they are external, they're going to be threats. And here, I don't want you to get caught up on whether something is a threat or a weakness. If it's negative, it's negative, okay? Don't worry, just list it down. Of course, for each of the standards, we're going to have different considerations. For ISO 9001, we're going to have strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats relating. By the way, sorry, I didn't mention, a SWOT analysis is where we define the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats relating to your organization. So when doing this SWOT analysis, if doing it for ISO 9001, we're going to focus on quality. 14001, we're going to focus on the environment. ISO 45001, focusing on health and safety, so on and so forth. And there might be different considerations, okay? So for example, when it comes to the environment, an opportunity might be that there is an increased awareness of environmental factors within the market from the client side. We can also see that there are specific funding opportunities to invest in renewable energy. Okay, a threat might be that clients might not be willing to pay extra to have an environmentally friendly product. Okay, a strength might be that all employees are motivated to protect the environment. A weakness might be that the company doesn't have sufficient internal resources to adequately invest in the environment. So as you can see, this was a quick SWOT analysis done for a company implementing ISO 14001. And as you can imagine, if we are implementing different standards, then we're going to have different considerations when doing this SWOT analysis. Interested parties, we have the same situation over here, where, as I mentioned earlier in this seminar, in clause 4.2, we have to define the needs and expectations of different interested parties. And depending on the standard that we are implementing, we have to consider different types of hats, of specializations. If talking about ISO 9001, for example, what do our clients need from us? What does the government need from us? They want us to pay taxes. They want us to employ as many people as possible to reduce the unemployment rate. When it comes to ISO 45001, for example, the needs of expectations might be our neighbors. Okay, so an interested party might be, if we are, for example, a construction company, or even if we are a manufacturing company, are we impacting our neighbors with our operation? And if we are, what are their needs and expectations? What do they want from our organization? Okay, they want us to follow all legal requirements when it comes to health and safety. And here we are also talking, for example, about noise. Okay, so health and safety doesn't necessarily mean that someone needs to be physically hurt or actually dead, okay, to consider it as a health and safety element, but rather we are considering neighbors, for example, and whether we're affecting their mental health, for example, through making excessive noise. And for example, if we have an office company, okay, if we have people working in the office, are we making sure that they have the right ergonomic setup to their desk? Okay, do they have to bend their neck for extended periods of time? Do they have to work alone, unattended, with no one to talk to for weeks at an end, which can result in loneliness? Okay, so these are the types of expectations that and needs that different interested parties might have for different types of standards. And that is effectively what clause 4 is about. Okay, and then we have about the management system. Okay, where in clause 4 we're talking about the management system. Okay, and effectively nothing needs to be done to meet the requirement of clause 4.4 of any of these standards. Clause 5 talks about leadership. Okay, and when talking about leadership, first of all, we are much more interested in seeing an active commitment by the top management in the organization towards improving the management system. However, from a more documentation or evidence based, first of all, I'd like to mention that clauses 5.1, 5.2, and 5.3 are all the same for the four standards that I'm mentioning right now. And ISO 45001 has an extra clause, which is clause 5.4. And I'm going to be explaining about that shortly. So, leadership and commitment, there is nothing that we have to do particularly to meet that requirement, except that the auditor will want to see how top management are involving themselves within the management system. Okay, so if they are running around in the plant talking with employees, nothing else needs to be done from a documentation point of view on this regard. Clause 5.2 is talks about policy. Okay, so it might be a quality policy for ISO 9001. It might be a health and safety policy for ISO 45001. And this is typically a one-page document which is signed by top management of the organization as a last resort of what they are doing to show commitment to the management system. Okay, and here we are seeing the fact that, for example, in the policy, we have to state that the company is committed towards meeting the needs and expectations of all stakeholders, that they are committed to the continual improvement of the management system, and so on and so forth. Okay. In this case, it might be ideal to use some type of template to make sure that you are following exactly what has to be said within that particular policy. Clause 5.3 just states that everyone within the organization must know their roles and responsibilities and their authorities within the organization. And then this idea is mentioned again briefly in, for example, clause 7.2, which talks about competence for all of these standards. So to meet the requirement of this particular clause, clause 5.3, and of clause 7.2, we would create job descriptions. And that is one application of how one document can meet the requirements of um, uh, multiple requirements within the standard. Okay. Clause 4.1 is specific to ISO 45001, and basically it asks us, first of all, to if more than 10 people work with the organization, we have to have some type of health and safety committee. Ideally, there would be a representative of this health and safety committee, and ideally, this person would be elected by conducting a small election within the organization. And then the standard asks us to actively seek the participation and consultation of workers within the organization, where they can all talk to the workers' representative. And then we would expect to see some type of meeting between the workers' representative and top management of the organization, whereby the representative, of the workers will have the opportunity to present the ideas and suggestions that employees came up with when it comes to health and safety. Okay, so that was clause 5. Clause 6 talks about planning. Okay, and here we have the very famous clause of risks and opportunities, which is present in all standards, once again, following the high-level structure. And here we have to consider risks and opportunities. Now, earlier, we have mentioned, let's go back. Earlier, we have mentioned that in clause 4.1, we're going to define the internal and external, positive and negative issues. Negative issues can be weaknesses and threats. So here we can take those weaknesses and threats and feed them to the matrix that we are using to define our risks. We can take the strengths and opportunities and feed them to the opportunities system that we are using in clause 6.1. When it comes to risks and opportunities, and as you can appreciate, I cannot go into all the level of detail in this seminar, but here I'm just trying to give you an overview of the requirements of the standard. When it comes to risks and opportunities, we will need to prioritize these. For example, when it comes to risks, we can prioritize them on severity, occurrence, and detection. Okay? For those who are familiar with the manufacturing industry, we can do an FMEA, okay, failure mode and effects analysis, to prioritize our risks. For those who aren't, don't worry, if we are working together, I will explain this in a lot of more detail and I will actually do it with you. You will just need to give me ratings from 1 to 10 of each particular risk in terms of severity. How severe would it be if something were to happen? Occurrence, how likely is for that element to happen? And detection, how easy is it for us to notice that we have a particular issue? Of course, when it comes to detection, the less easy is it for us to know that there is an issue, the higher the ranking will be. If we can get a warning 3 days in advance that a lightning will struck a particular pole, we will tape that pole, with 5 blocks away, making sure that no one visits that particular spot. But that's not how lightning struck works. It just strikes without any warning. In that case, the detection is abysmal. Therefore, we're going to give the highest rating of detection because we have absolutely no way of identifying the exact spot of where a lightning strike will hit. Moving on, clause 6.2 talks about objectives, I would say, rather than quality objectives. And if we are implementing ISO 9001, granted, they will be quality objectives. But if we're implementing ISO 45001, it will be health and safety objectives. 27001, it will be information security objectives, so on and so forth. Okay. In clause 6.2, 6.3, the standard, mind you, a quick side note about clause 6.2 is that objectives have to be SMART. Okay, SMART means specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. I'm noticing that my time is soon going to pass, so we'll try to be a bit faster. Clause 7 talks about support. Okay, support. Here we are talking about people, we are talking about equipment, and we are talking about documents. When it comes to people, we have to make sure that there is the right job descriptions in place and that they have been adequately trained on the particular topic, whether it's quality, information security, health and safety, etc. When it comes to equipment, we have to make sure that we have an equipment maintenance plan and that we have maintenance records, okay? Any type of equipment that is needed to run our operation. For example, for health and safety and the environment, we'll check that there are fire extinguishers in place. When it comes to quality, we might talk about the actual machinery that is used to produce the product or to deliver the product to the client, or that the software that we are using is updated. When it comes to information security, here we are talking that, for example, the air conditioner inside the server room is adequately maintained and that there is a good suppression system that is maintained so that if something were to happen to the server, something will be able to immediately handle it automatically and not allow that to turn into a huge fire. Okay, so that is a quick point about clause 7. When it comes to clause 8, as I've mentioned, this is where the juice of the actual standard is, okay? And this is different for all standards. So clause 8 for ISO 9001 talks about these 8 clauses, okay? Sub-clauses, I should say. And here what we're effectively saying is that in clause 8.1, there is no specific requirement that we have to meet. Then clause 8.2 talks about sales, clause 8.3 talks about design, clause 8.4 talks about purchasing, 8.5 talks about the operations, okay? 8.6 talks about releasing a product which can be considered as part of operations. Clause 8.7 talks about defects when we have a quality issue, okay? So in a nutshell, for clause 8, in ISO 9001, we have to map out the processes for sales, purchasing, operations, and design, if applicable. Clause 8.7, which is control of non-conforming outputs, is again discussed in clause 10 of the standard on all standards, which talks about corrective and preventive actions. Again, this is another example of the standard repeating itself, and I don't repeat myself to my clients to make sure that I don't overwhelm them, and I only ask them the questions that I need to ask them to make sure that, they have other things to worry about. They don't need to worry about ISO certification if we're doing it together. When it comes to ISO 14001 and ISO 45001, they talk about the same elements, which is operational planning and control and emergency preparedness and response, okay? Granted, 8.1 talks into a bit of more detail that we can have an input on how we design and develop the product, on the external providers that we choose, on how we operate as a business, and how we deliver and dispose of the product, okay, given that we are talking about the environment. And particularly, it talks about emergency preparedness and response. What will happen if we were to have an issue relating to the environment, and do we have the systems in place to make sure that we protect the environment? For example, in terms of bread or raisa, when it comes to manufacturing, what will we do if we have a leakage of air, for example? So as you can imagine, if it's clean air, it's not going to be a problem of direct pollution, but to keep on producing that air, we are consuming much more electricity than we need to. So how will we tackle the situation in that case? How will we tackle the situation if we have an oil spill, for example, or if we do injection molding, for example, if we drop any plastic granules on the floor, how are we going to pick them up and how are we going to dispose of them? Okay, so those are the types of emergency preparedness and response policies or procedures that we would want to have for ISO 14001. When it comes to ISO 45001, naturally here we're talking about health and safety. So we're not talking as such about the protection of the environment. Here we are talking about the protection of health and of the life of people working within the organization and any other stakeholder, even visitors, for example, to our clients' premises if we are working at their premises, okay? So what will happen if someone gets hurt or if there is a near miss, okay? So an incident is when someone actually gets hurt an incident is when someone, or excuse me, a near miss is when someone is almost going to get hit. How are we going to handle that scenarios? What type of incidents might we have? We might have slippage, we might have people loading heavy equipment, we might have people working alone in the offices. I have a client, for example, who does lecturing. They are a school, but they do lecturing in highly dangerous areas, okay, in war zones typically. So in that case, they have to have procedures on the evacuation, bunkering, how they turn the classroom into a bunker, okay? So once again, this greatly depends on the organization that you have and the type of risks that are relevant to your organization. And these risks would have been discussed in clause 6.1, as I've mentioned earlier, after having done a SWOT analysis in clause 4 earlier. So hopefully now you are starting to see the things, how they link up to each other, even though we didn't have a lot of time together. Finally, the clause 8 of ISO 27001, excuse me, talks about risk, okay? So ISO 27001 is different from other standards because it has Annex A. And Annex A of the latest version of ISO 27001 is a list of 93 controls, okay? And these controls have to be considered by the organization, okay? And based on these controls, we have to do a risk assessment, okay? So for example, one of the controls mentioned within this list would be what happens when a new person joins the company, or what happens when a person leaves the company. So when a person joins, what risks are associated with giving them user access rights, for example, to make sure that they only have access to the information that they need. Then we have once a person leaves the company or joins a different department, what type of systems do we have in place to make sure that we collect all the assets of the organization back, for example, collecting the laptop, access control cards, keys, etc., uniforms, okay, because of course a uniform allows a person to impersonate someone else. So when it comes to Annex A of ISO 27001, it's giving us a list of these controls, and then we have to do a risk assessment. And the first thing that we have to do, of course, is to do the actual risk assessment, and then we have to come up with a treatment plan. We have to come up with mitigation actions to solve issues that we have identified in the risk assessment to ideally mitigate such risks and seize any opportunities that we might have as a business. As you can see, clause 8.1 was repeated in all standards, operational planning and control, and even though it says a lot of things when you're reading it, all of those topics are covered in all other requirements of the standard, and this is the third example of the standard repeating itself that I have mentioned just in this seminar. Moving on to clause 9. Clause 9 talks about performance evaluation. So I have mentioned multiple times in this seminar the fact that I encourage you that when you are implementing an ISO standards to start managing your business based on data rather than on opinions. And as such, clause 9 is dedicated on that element, where in ISO 9001, it asks us to get feedback from our clients to make sure that they are happy with our performance. ISO 14001 and 45001 ask us to track results relating to compliance, okay? And ISO 27001 does not have any specific metrics that we have to measure. But all of them ask us to do internal audits, management reviews, and to consider other elements for us to make sure that we are continuously acquiring the data that will help us to take informed decisions on the topic of our management system. Last but not least, and in my opinion, this is one of the most important elements of the management system, which is clause 10, and it's called improvement, because no matter how much we try and no matter how many systems and procedures we have in place, we will still keep on making mistakes because we are still human beings. Okay. But the most important thing is that we learn from our mistakes. And the standard has a 5 step process. All standards follow the same 5 step process that we have to go through whenever there is an incident, whether it's a quality incident, an environmental issue, a health and safety injury or near miss, a security incident. We have to pass through this 5 step process. First of all, we have to describe the problem, what happened. Secondly, we have to define what did we do in the short term to fix the problem. Thirdly, and this typically happens a few days after the incident occurred. Thirdly, we're going to identify the root cause. What caused that issue to happen in the first place? And here we shouldn't go at the first um, um, thing that comes to mind, because if we don't correctly identify the root cause, then coming up with a solution will be futile if we didn't identify the right root cause. So when identifying the root cause, we can use techniques like, for example, the 5 why technique, okay, where when you come up, for example, we had, let me give you an example of a company, for example, and they're doing a delivery, and there was a breakdown in the van whilst doing this delivery. So in the short term, they sent another van to replace it. Okay, so the description is that there was a breakdown of the van whilst doing delivery. In the short term, they found a solution and sent another van. Now we have to identify the root cause. Why did the van stop? Because ما نعرفش, it had an issue with some part of its engine. Why did it have an issue with some part of its engine? Because maintenance wasn't done properly. Why wasn't maintenance done properly? Because we don't have a maintenance plan of what needs to be done. Why don't we have a maintenance plan for each of our vehicles if they are so important that we do delivery with them? Because our garage is disorganized and no one is actively looking at the paperwork as being handled by the garage. Okay, so I didn't get to 5 whys here. I got to 4 whys. The next possible why could be because either the garage is understaffed or because no one from management is actively looking into the procedures or because we start a system but we leave it. So that is the root cause that we are trying to identify over here. So that is clause 10. So giving you the full picture once again of these 5 steps: describe the problem, say what you did in the short term, identifying the root cause, implementing a solution that will fix the root cause, and a few months after implementing the solution, we need to double check that the solution that we implemented actually solved the problem that we had in the first place. That is all I had for today's session. If you have any questions, I encourage you to, I know once again, and I excuse myself for going overboard. As you can probably see, this is a very interesting subject to me, and I can keep on talking about the topic of continual improvement, which is the actual topic of ISO certification, indefinitely. However, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask me, you can feel free to go ahead. Okay, so Stephanie, I just mentioned that if you have any questions that you'd like to ask me, feel free to go ahead. In the meantime, if you are looking to implement an ISO certification, I am happy to assist your organization in this exciting process. Basically, yes, implementing ISO standards is what I do. A side note that I also wanted to mention was that I am not a salesperson, in the sense that if I'm working with your organization, I will be working directly with you, okay? I will not send someone else. You know, I actively work with all my clients myself because it gives me pride and joy to see that all my clients are actively improving on their processes. I don't know if anyone has any specific questions. I'm going to stop talking for a second um, um, and leave the floor up to you.
Thank you, Luke. It was a good refreshing course, and appreciate all you said today. Don't have any questions off the top of my head, but I'll keep your contact information for future reference.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So, I guess that given the fact that I didn't receive any questions as yet, I'll take that as a fantastic um, uh, comment, meaning that everything that I've explained was understood by all of you. And as we are saying, if you have any questions, I'm available to help your organization to implement the standard. So that's all I have for you for today's session, and I look forward to possibly